Good morning and welcome to this video where we'll be discussing human rights as I understand it, as I understand them. I think we're going to need a new channel. We'll go through what we mean by human rights, what that looks like in action, and what that should look like if we're doing it right. Let's start with probably the most famous declaration of human rights in the English-speaking world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to steer or abolish it. So, self-evident and unalienable makes this seem like nobody could possibly contradict any of it. However, from that extract alone we can see that, for instance, maybe men should also include women. And if we know our way around history and around the subject a little bit, then we're probably aware that what we would now consider men are not necessarily included within their definition of men. And perhaps the less USAN sensibilities out there might start to wonder how self-evident it is that these rights were endowed by a creator, and maybe that doesn't matter at all. What are our human rights and what should they be? Well, luckily we have some standard definitions, and when we talk about those definitions we group them into generations depending on when people started thinking maybe this is important. Gen 1 is liberty. It's what that chunk of the Declaration of Independence was mostly talking about. The important bit is that you can do what you want when you want, but we immediately see that there's a problem here, and actually we need to modify this to say that you can do what you want when you want as long as it doesn't cause a problem for anybody else doing what they want when they want. So that means you are allowed to think what you want, vote for who you want, know who you want, and not be jailed or killed without a good reason. All good stuff. Gen 2 then is all about equality. This is that instant complaint we had about that excerpt from the Declaration of Independence. This is where we have to start expanding all men to actually mean all men, not to mention all women, and then to also give them the ability to use those rights effectively. It's no good saying that everybody has the right to express their opinion if one person has the ability to express their opinion and the other one doesn't have the ability to express their opinion. So that means we're going to be able to create, for instance, trade unions where people are going to be able to work together and express themselves as they wish. So the rights apply equally and people can do whatever they need to do to get onto an equal playing field. Great stuff. Then we get to Gen 3. And it all becomes a bit more wishy and a bit more washy, because now we get to quality of life stuff that would hinder all of the other previous stuff if it weren't there. So we're looking at things like food, shelter, environmental protections, all of the things that we need to be comfortable in our lives. Just the best stuff. We now know what human rights traditionally are, but it's important to keep in mind who human rights should apply to, and that is government, people in power. And that was right there in that initial Declaration of Independence statement, where if the government starts taking away those rights, then you have to take away that government. And the important flip side to this is that in theory, somebody like Twitter, for instance, cannot take away your human rights because they are not the government. Now, complying with all these human rights are what we call negative responsibilities. The government doesn't have to do something, the government has to just not do something. Now, you might think to yourself that some positive responsibilities are naturally going to result from this, and you'd be absolutely right. Human right. For instance, if life is a right, then maybe you have to have a justice system that is going to criminalize murder. But once you have a justice system, if you now need a right to not be unfairly incarcerated or executed, then the government has to implement laws about fair trials and proper representation and so on. And this is where it all gets a little bit squishy. Because at what point do those positive responsibilities stop? Which is actually where you get to decide whether you are for big or small government. Because the government exists to protect your rights. So you need a government as big as it takes to actually protect those rights. While we're here, let's go on a little bit of a tangent. So you remember Gen 2? They wanted equality for everybody. So your obvious result of that is anti-discrimination rules. But that also results in the corollary of anti-discrimination rules, and that is anti-indirect discrimination rules. For instance, I might be able to convince you that teachers deserve a cap on their wages. However, for the sake of the best running schools, heads of departments and heads of schools should not have a cap on their wages, because a cap on their wages would mean that you would not get the best people, and you want the best teachers to become heads of department and so on, maybe. And that might seem perfectly reasonable to you. What if I were to tell you that it turns out that 90% of teachers are women and 90% of heads are men? Suddenly, it all becomes a little shakier. Now, obviously, these numbers are pulled directly from my rectum, but the thought experiment works and is represented quite well in certain industries, possibly in teaching, depending where you live and what kind of teaching you're doing. But the point is that if you have an industry that is predominantly made up of one demographic, then any law that affects that industry as a whole is actually a law affecting that demographic, and thus potentially discriminatory. So I'll let you mull over the ramifications of all of that. But the important thing here is to get us thinking about how the concept of indirect human rights violations affects our understanding of what we want governments to do about those rights. So let's bring it back to those initial exemplars of human rights that we had from the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and happiness. So liberty is very much Gen 1, but life, outside of potentially being a prerequisite for liberty, feels more like Gen 3. And you can already see how our indirect rights are starting to... But then what are your prerequisites for life? And then how do you go about protecting happiness, let alone life? And that's when we hit Gen 3 and we're starting to talk about food and shelter and a good environment, because without these things you cannot live and you cannot be happy. And this is our tipping point for what you want government to do. Do you want government to care about human rights or about human needs? Because it's all very well and good that the government not be actively trying to murder me, but should it be actively trying to keep me alive? Should it be feeding me? Should it be giving me shelter? Should it be giving me healthcare? It's all very well and good that the government not be preventing me from thinking what I want to think, but should it be providing me with an education so that I can be aware of the possibilities of thought? Should it be providing me with an internet connection so that I can expand my horizons and so that I can disseminate my thoughts? It's all very well and good that the government not prevent me from associating with the people that I want to associate with, but should it be providing me with buildings where we can get together? Should it be providing us with activities that we can participate in as a group? There's very much no right answer here, but let me put it to you that why the hell wouldn't we? What is the point of protecting human rights if you have no ability to affect those human rights? What good is a population that is allowed to do things if they have no ability to do those things? And as ever, it's actually more insidious than that. Because if you believe that human needs are not something that we are all entitled to, then the corollary is that only certain people are, at the very least, entitled to a comfortable life, and at worst, entitled to life at all. So if somebody is born with a condition that makes them incapable of doing any sort of useful work, do we as a society have a duty to help that person live? Is that for some reason only a burden on their family and the people who volunteer to take care of them? What about somebody who becomes disabled through accident or illness? Are they entitled to survival, or are they punished for not having set up an adequate insurance policy when they were still able-bodied? What about those people that are born into poverty, for instance, or maybe they're born with mental conditions that aren't quite as obvious, so maybe a less apparent section of the autism spectrum or some sort of schizophrenia, because they're able to work, but maybe they have a lot of trouble holding down a job, or maybe they have a lot of trouble getting a job in the first place. do we as a society have a responsibility to keep them alive? And then you have the obverse of that, which is, what about people who are both willing and able to work? Why do they have to work for a living when these other people do not have to work for a living? And maybe you're comfortable drawing that line between the kinds of people who deserve the help of the state and the kind of people who have to work for their lives, but I'm really not. Because if you suggest that people have to work for their living, then you are implying that people that do not work deserve to die. And besides that, I'm quite happy thinking that maybe the government should provide those basic needs for everybody, and that way people stop working for a living and start working for the sake of whatever that work is for. And perhaps that work will be better than the work they were only doing to keep themselves alive. So we should probably stop there, because we've actually covered quite a bit here. We now know what human rights are, we now know what they look like, we now know what they could look like. Not to mention that it's all starting to get a little bit grim. But maybe I'm wrong, and you should let me know that I'm wrong down in the comments. Or maybe I'm right, and you should let me know that I'm right down in the comments. And when you do either of those, you will, of course, let me know why I am wrong, why I am right. And maybe you can get a bit more stuck into some of the things that I've talked about, or maybe bring to light some of the things that I have failed to mention. And in the meantime, I'll go come up with some more videos, shall I? Yes. Yes, I shall.